Kendrick Lamar has quickly grown to become one of the most influential rappers of all time, with many coming to see him as the voice of our generation. His talent and the popularity of his music is undeniable, but what if I told you that there was something more to his music than meets the eye? Or, I guess in this case, meets the ear. See, over the years, I've listened to his albums countless times, and on repeat listens, I began to notice some common themes in his music, which led me to consider what the deeper meaning behind what he was saying was. Now look, by no means am I the first one to theorize on hidden meanings in Kendrick's music, but most discussions I've heard on the subject are either pretty surface level, or leave major details up to interpretation. And on top of this, many people limit their analysis to finding the deeper meaning of individual songs, but fail to identify the larger purpose in the context of his albums. But as I pondered on the true purpose of Kendrick's music, I was envisioning something on a much larger scale than any single track analysis could provide. Now, I'll spare you from having to endure a needlessly lengthy build-up to my main point and just come out with it. I believe that throughout his last 4 albums, Kendrick Lamar has been giving us bits and pieces of one big overarching storyline. Now, you may have heard of storytelling albums before, but this is different. What I'm telling you is that everything from Good Kid, M.A.A.d City all the way up to his newest release, Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers, has essentially served as one giant storytelling discography. And what's more, I think the latest release serves as the conclusion to it all, the end of a story that's been a decade in the making. I know that's a lot to take in, but today I'm going to break down exactly what that story is and what the deeper meaning behind Kendrick's music over the years has truly been. And to do that, we're going to dive into each of these albums to explain the significance of how it all ties together. So, without further ado, let's dive into things. Our story begins with Good Kid, M.A.A.d City. Now, quickly, I want to acknowledge that I know Section 80 is his first album, and while I'm sure there's plenty of connections to be made there, such as the second verse of Sing About Me serving as a sequel to Keisha's song, I overall don't think an overview of this album is entirely necessary to explain the larger narrative at work here. It's the same reason I won't be covering Untitled or the Black Panther album. All of these are fantastic bodies of music that I would highly recommend listening to, but in the interest of time, I won't be diving into them here. Just wanted to get that out of the way now before somebody addresses it in the comments. And along those lines, while Good Kid, M.A.A.d City is my personal favorite of his albums, it's also the album I'll spend the least amount of time discussing because I think the story is told a bit more directly here than it would be on future albums, and thus doesn't require as deep of an analysis to make sense of. Good Kid, M.A.A.d City tells the story of Kendrick as a teenager growing up in Compton and learning from his surroundings. It's sort of a coming-of-age story where we witness Kendrick and his friends driving around town, seeing what kind of trouble they can get into. Backseat Freestyle is the clearest example of this, as it's literally framed as Kendrick just having fun and freestyling in the car with his friends. But while this track captures the lighthearted excitement that only teenage adventures could provide, the rest of the album showcases Kendrick wrestling with the complexities and dangers of navigating life in Compton. The art of peer pressure shows him exploring a life of crime because of his friend's influence. Good Kid details his experiences with gang violence and racial profiling from police officers. And as Kendrick continues telling the story of his youth through these tracks, it becomes increasingly clear that this sort of life isn't meant for him. This revelation occurs to Kendrick after he's pushed to his breaking point when his friend is killed in a drive-by shooting, which you can hear at the end of Swimming Pools. The aftermath of this tragedy is explored on the next track, Sing About Me I'm Dying of Thirst, where Kendrick contemplates the nature of existence and grows increasingly angry. But it's only when a woman approaches him and his friends that things will take a more optimistic turn. This woman encourages the young boys to find God, because only His power can save them from the curse of their current state. This message hits home for Kendrick, and on the following track, Real, Kendrick arrives at the conclusion that the sort of life he's been living doesn't make someone real. At the end of the song, Kendrick's father tells him that what makes someone real is taking responsibility, caring for your family, and most importantly, real is God. Following this message, Kendrick's mom tells him that when he makes it big as a rapper, he should make sure to learn from his mistakes and come back to tell his story to his community and give back to his city. This will be very important to the story we're piecing together moving forward, so be sure to keep this in mind. So, to recap the major takeaways from this album, Kendrick grew up in rough circumstances and dedicated his life to making it as an aspiring rapper with the hopes of escaping his troubled situation. He finds a sense of purpose through God and resolves to use his skills as a rapper to reach a better life, but his mom reminds him that when he does make it big, he needs to use that influence to take care of his community.
My knees getting weak and my gun might blow, but we gon' be alright. Nigga, we gon' be alright.
This brings us to Pimp, a Butterfly, and this is where the story becomes much more layered. To kick things off, I want to hone in on the track How Much a Dollar Cost. This song tells a story about Kendrick Lamar's experience with a homeless person he encountered outside of a gas station. The homeless man asks Kendrick for $1, which he promptly denies the man, claiming that he can't afford it, even though he pretty obviously can. After a series of verbal exchanges between the two men, the old man uses faith to justify his request, asking Kendrick, "Have you ever opened up to Exodus 14? A humble man is all that we ever need." Exodus 14 is the story of Moses parting the Red Sea to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. The homeless man is essentially asking Kendrick to be the Moses of his people and lead the black community to freedom. However, as the old man suggests, Kendrick won't be capable of accomplishing this until he learns to be humble about his earnings and status in society. In verse 3, Kendrick once again denies the man the money for selfish reasons. In response, the old man reveals the biggest plot twist of all time, that he's actually been God in disguise the whole time, and this has been one big test that Kendrick has failed. The man answers the track's title question in saying that this dollar has now cost Kendrick his spot in heaven. The reason I'm discussing this track now is because religion is a pretty central theme to this story, and How Much a Dollar Costs is arguably the most religiously charged song on the album, and it's the one I see as the most pivotal song to this whole storyline. But let's take a step back and talk about Lucy. Lucy is a figure Kendrick refers to several times throughout the album, such as when he says, "What you want, you a house or a car, 40 acres and a mule, a piano, a guitar? Anything, see my name's Lucy, I'm your dog." Like others have theorized, I believe Lucy is a shortened form of Lucifer, the devil. This is why Lucy is only ever portrayed as a negative influence with evil all around her, and is often seen tempting Kendrick into focusing more on money, greed, and status. And of course, Lucy is successful in corrupting Kendrick, ultimately leading to his damnation on How Much a Dollar Cost. Throughout the album's runtime, Kendrick slowly pieces together a long poem, adding in a new line or two after every couple of tracks. This poem tells the story of Kendrick Lamar, who had become rich but was abusing his newfound influence on society for selfish purposes. The people of Compton, his hometown, no longer cared about him because he abandoned his people after becoming rich. This poem is recited to his idol Tupac on the track Mortal Man at the end of the album. Mortal Man is a song that revolves around the idea of famous people losing their fans after stories of bad things they've done start to circulate. Yeah, Kendrick kinda predicted cancel culture. But anyway, this indicates Kendrick's frustration with his hometown, who no longer supports him, and he fears this will only grow worse now that he's lost God's goodwill. After reciting his poem at the end of the track, Kendrick has a conversation with Tupac. He asked about a metaphor Tupac once used when he said, "The ground is going to open up and swallow the evil." Tupac explains that this is about how the poor will one day consume the rich and evil. Kendrick asks Tupac if he's afraid of this, but Pac assures Kendrick that he's never considered himself to be rich because he lives his life selflessly, using his skills and elevated status to give back to his people and community. This highlights the major difference between Kendrick and Tupac. While both rappers came from nothing but made it big, Tupac made sure to use his influence to give back to Compton, whereas Kendrick ran as far away from his old life as he could. So we can understand this poor consuming the rich metaphor to be the underprivileged members of Compton turning their back on Kendrick. This leads Kendrick to ask Pac how he managed to keep his sanity while rising up to a higher status than his peers. Pac lists off the things that helped, but the first one he mentions is by his faith in God. Kendrick then asks if he sees himself as a fighter at heart or someone who only reacts when placed in a corner. Pac explains that if he's ever been faced with a challenge, he doesn't give up fighting. Now, there's a lot going on here, and it can be easy to gloss over the subtext of this conversation, but it's important to read between the lines here because it very clearly indicates what direction our story is heading in on the next album. Tupac's responses to the questions Kendrick poses leads Kendrick to have three important realizations. 1. He's in danger as he's now lost the goodwill of both his community and God. 2. The faith in God is what matters most in life. 3. No matter what, Kendrick should not give up trying. So, Kendrick gains a new resolve that he should try to redeem himself in God's eyes and earn his spot in heaven back after losing it on How Much a Dollar Costs. After Kendrick asks how long Pac thinks someone like him can keep fighting, Pac responds in saying this. In this country, a black man only have like 5 years we can exhibit maximum strength, and that's right now while you're a teenager, while you're still strong, or while you still want to lift weights, while you still want to shoot back. Because once you turn 30, it's like they take the heart and soul out of a man, out of a black man in this country, and you don't want to fight no more. Now it's worth noting that Tupac mentions that Kendrick is a teenager, which means it's possible that this conversation took place back in the Good Kid, M.A.A.d City era, and Kendrick is only reflecting on this conversation at the end of To Pimp a Butterfly since it's incredibly relevant to his current circumstances. That might change the interpretation here a little bit, but I think either way of looking at it leads us to the same conclusion. After Tupac shares his wisdom, Kendrick is left with only one word to reply with. Damn.
Keep it on the high note. It's levels.
Okay, yeah, he also recites the caterpillar and butterfly poem, but that wouldn't make for nearly as cool of a transition, so anyway, onwards to Damn.
I know, bitch, be humble. Bitch, sit down. Be humble.
So my thoughts on this whole interconnected storyline first came to be after listening to Damn. The more I listened to this album, the more I began to see it as a direct sequel to what I listened to on To Pimp a Butterfly. To make that clear, let's explore what this album is all about. After his damnation on how much a dollar costs and remembering Pac's words of encouragement on Mortal Man, Damn tells the story of Kendrick's efforts to redeem himself in the eyes of God by acting as a leader for the black community, taking on that metaphorical Moses role God asked of him back on how much a dollar costs. This is the reason why this album is full of biblical references around every corner. Kendrick has taken on the role of a prophet, and he goes around teaching others the importance of their faith and other important values of life. Now, people have theorized that the album Damn was meant to be listened to in the reverse order of the tracks that appear on the album. So rather than listening from Blood up to Duckworth, you would instead listen from Duckworth back to Blood. I know that sounds a little out there, but Kendrick himself has even acknowledged this theory. In an MTV News interview, Kendrick mentioned that while the order doesn't necessarily change the story, it does make it flow better.
After a week of the album came out, they realized you can't listen to the album backwards, and it plays as a full story. And even a better rhythm. It's one of my favorites, rhythms and tempos within the album. And it's something that we definitely premeditate while we're being in the studio.
How does the story change playing in the different directions?
I don't think the story necessarily changes. I think the feel changes.
And this detail can even be seen by the collector's edition featuring the tracks listed in the reverse order. Like Kendrick says, I don't think it matters much which way you listen to the album, but I do believe that the reverse order works better for explaining the storyline here. So what I want to do is go through the tracks in reverse order to analyze exactly how this story is told. In the interest of time, I'm only going to cover the tracks that stuck out as especially relevant, so a couple of tracks will be left out here or there. But anyway, let's dive in with Duckworth. The first thing we hear on this track is the phrase, "It was always me versus the world until I found it's me versus me." This is a reference to the realization Kendrick comes to on To Pimp a Butterfly. It was him versus the world before he made it big, but after becoming rich, Kendrick became his own worst enemy, and his selfishness caused him to fall to the powers of evil. The next line we hear him say is an anthem repeated a few times throughout the album, which says, "Just remember what happens on earth stays on earth." This serves as a reminder to the listener to focus on their relationship with God above all else, because earthly possessions will stay on earth after we all die. This is a very important theme to this album, which is why it's repeated so many times. And in an interview, Kendrick even confirmed that an alternative album title he considered was, in fact, What Happens on Earth Stays on Earth.
Did you ever have another album title for Damn?
Yep.
What was it?
What happens on Earth stays on Earth.
What happens on Earth
Stays on Earth.
Why not that? That's a long ass title.
It's a long.
Too,
there you
yeah,
go.
you know what I'm saying? That's
I like
Kendrick
that,
Lamar.
though.
What happens on Earth? What is
But anyway, Duckworth. I love this song, and the story he tells is really cool. In fact, I'm not even going to spoil the story, because if you haven't heard this song, I really think you should go give it a close listen. I think it has one of the coolest twists I've ever heard in a rap song. But anyway, the story he tells itself isn't particularly important here. What is important is the fact that Kendrick is telling the story at all. See, the story is meant to teach the lesson that life can be tricky, but you have to trust that everything will work out. And who is Kendrick telling this story to? Well, at the beginning, before Kendrick starts the story, he says, "Children, listen, it gets deep," meaning that he's telling the story to a group of kids to teach them a valuable lesson about life. This implies that Kendrick has taken on the role of a teacher or a prophet for these kids. Moving to the song Fear, we hear the track open and close with Kendrick's cousin Carl calling to leave him a voicemail where he discusses the book of Deuteronomy. He focuses on the idea that the minorities of the world are the Israelites the Bible refers to. Now remember, Kendrick is supposed to be the leader of the metaphorical Israelites, and so this song reaffirms the idea of Kendrick acting as the metaphorical Moses, who's to lead the Israelites, or in this case, the minority community, to freedom and greatness. Remember at the beginning of the video when I mentioned that people have come to see him as the voice of our generation? This speaks to the divine mission he's been describing in his music. On the song XXX, Kendrick's friend has a son who was killed. He asked Kendrick for spiritual guidance, saying, "K-Dot, can you pray for me? It's been a fucked up day for me. I know that you're anointed. Show me how to overcome." This is a pretty clear demonstration that people are starting to look to Kendrick for religious guidance and advice. It can be reasonably assumed that this person contacting Kendrick is from Compton or an area that faces similar struggles. So someone from the city who once stopped caring about Kendrick is now looking to him as a leader, marking his transition from being a greedy, selfish man to one who leads and teaches others. There's also a point in this track where Kendrick goes to talk about gun control, showing how he aims to use his influence and status to give back to his community rather than remaining selfish like he was on To Pimp a Butterfly. This, of course, brings us to the biggest hit single from the album, Humble. And Humble marks the point where everything comes full circle in our story here. How so, you might be asking? Well, once again, let's think back to how much a dollar costs. God tells Kendrick on this track, a humble man is all we need. At the time, he hadn't learned this lesson yet, but now he's reached the point where he's teaching this lesson to others. Humble is a song that's aimed at people who are bragging about their money and power, telling them that having all this doesn't matter if you're living your life selfishly. If you don't live a humble life and maintain your faith in God, none of this is important, and he's delivering this message from personal experience while he's on his path to redemption. Element is another song that opens in saying, just remember what happens on earth stays on earth. And later in the song, Kendrick makes a point of saying, I don't do it for the gram, I do it for Compton. Meaning that he's taken a new stance on life as opposed to his outlook on To Pimp a Butterfly. He's now returned to save his community instead of focusing on social status. Moving to Ya, we get the line, I'm an Israelite, don't call me black no more. That word is only a color, it ain't facts no more. My cousin called, my cousin Carl Duckworth said, know my worth, and Deuteronomy say that we all been cursed. I know he walks the earth. This is a callback to Fear, with the voicemail from his cousin Carl that we discussed earlier. This shows that the message that Carl preached has been received and embraced by Kendrick. Also, that last line, I know he walks the earth, is a direct reference to his knowledge of God's existence on earth, since he's personally encountered him on how much a dollar costs. Lastly, the title of the song, Yah, is likely a reference to Yahweh or Yahuwah, both of which are names associated with God by the Israelites. And so this brings us to the end on Blood. I had difficulties making meaning out of this track at first. It's not so much a song, but rather a skit, and yet this skit carries some of the most important narrative points in the story so far. I think Blood represents the end of Kendrick's journey towards redemption. The track starts out by posing the question, is it wickedness? Is it weakness? You decide. Are we gonna live or die? I think the question of wickedness or weakness is in reference to who he used to be. He's questioning if he was ever truly evil or wicked to begin with, or if he was just weak and unprepared to handle his newly gained power. The question of whether he's going to live or die could be him asking God if he's destined for heaven or hell after all he's gone through since their last encounter on how much a dollar costs. But it could also represent a greater concern for his community since he uses the word we here. He might be trying to guide his community to the right path, indicating that if we continue to make the wrong decisions and hold the wrong priorities, we're destined for failure. As Blood continues, Kendrick sees an old blind lady struggling and pacing back and forth in the street. It's worth noting that this is the exact kind of person Kendrick would have likely avoided before, just like the old man at the gas station. But now that he's at the end of his journey for redemption, Kendrick walks up to offer his help to this woman. The woman turns around and kills Kendrick. I think the blind woman could be a metaphor for the black community. Our circumstances can lead us to remain blind to the solutions at hand, and this blindness causes us to focus on the wrong priorities, much like Kendrick did on the previous album. And in the worst cases, this blindness can sometimes lead us to kill each other, just as the old lady does to Kendrick here. But anyway, there you have it. If you're still not convinced that this album was designed as a direct sequel to Pimp a Butterfly, then think back to Immortal Man. You'll recall that Tupac claims that once a man turns 30, he loses his will to fight and his soul. Kendrick Lamar released Damn when he was 29, just 2 months before turning 30. This was Kendrick's last chance to fight for redemption, and his death at the end of the album marks a critical moment in the storyline. It's now time for Kendrick's judgment. What does the afterlife have in store for him? Is it good enough that he's turned his life around and helped his people, or will he continue to be damned in alignment with the title of this album? Well, unfortunately, this is where the album ends, and we're not provided with an answer here. However, shortly after the release of the album, Kendrick changed his profile picture on social media accounts to a picture of him standing in front of a blue brick wall. This picture was very similar to the Damn album cover, with a blue wall serving as a contrast to the red wall. Like others have theorized, I believe the red wall represents the red flames of hell and damnation, whereas the blue wall represents heaven and salvation. This picture could also be meant to indicate that after his journey came to an abrupt end on Blood, he was forgiven and accepted into heaven. But for many, myself included, this wasn't enough of an answer. I eagerly sat in anticipation for Kendrick's next album so I could finally get the confirmation on how things ended in the form of a new song. And well, if you've been closely following Kendrick's music, then you know it was a very, very long wait because we wouldn't receive a new album for 5 years. But in May 2022, we got Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers. And like I said at the start of all this is the album that finally concludes the story.
Take off perception, take off the cop with the iPad, take off the allure, take off the unsure, take off decisions I had.
Going into this album, I was obviously expecting answers about Kendrick's fate. My prediction was that there would be underlying themes of a Judgment Day type of event going on in the background of this music. And what we got for the storyline was, well, kind of disappointing to me at first. Don't get me wrong, the album was fantastic as always. But at first it didn't seem like it connected to the storyline at all. In fact, it almost seemed like it actively went against some of the ideas that had been established in the storyline so far. There were no significant references to Kendrick being in heaven or hell, or any follow-up on his death at the end of the last album. And any reference to Kendrick being a leader in the black community was met with a sort of reluctance to remain that figure moving forward. I didn't really get it, but then I realized there was a missing link here that made all of this make a lot more sense. The Heart Part 5. If you didn't know, The Heart is a series of tracks Kendrick releases before a major project. He continued this trend by releasing The Heart Part 5 just before Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers released. I hadn't considered that The Heart Part 5 could be relevant to the story because up to this point none of the other parts of The Heart had played a major role, so when I listened to it for the first time I wasn't listening for a continuation of the story. But on repeat listens, I realized something I completely overlooked the first time. In the third verse, Kendrick raps from the perspective of the late Nipsey Hussle, aiming to provide his friends, fans, and family with a sense of closure. This is made clear both by the lyrics and by the fact that the music video shows some deep faking Nipsey's face during this section. But take a close listen to some of the lines Kendrick says here. As I bleed through the speakers, feel my presence. To my brother, to my kids, I'm in heaven. To my mother, to my sis, I'm in heaven. To my father, to my wife, I'm serious, this is heaven. To my friends, make sure you count them blessings. To my fans, make sure you make them investments. And to the killer that sped up my demise, I forgive you, just know your soul's in question. I see the pain in your pupil when that trigger had squeezed, and though you did me gruesome, I was surely relieved. I completed my mission, wasn't ready to leave, but fulfilled my days, my creator was pleased. I know this is framed in the context of Nipsey Hussle's death, but doesn't it also perfectly align with the ending of Damn? I realize that it might seem like a stretch to think it all applies to the story here, but Kendrick Lamar is no stranger to including double meanings in his lyrics, and I don't think including a double meaning here would detract at all from the impact of making this about Nipsey Hussle. In fact, I would even say that it adds to it. Kendrick sees Nipsey Hussle as an embodiment of everything he was personally striving for, a leader in the black community who died after giving his all to his community. Nipsey's real-life death mirrors the metaphorical death Kendrick had described on Damn, and so he honors him here by letting his life and death serve as a direct representation of the story he's told. And from that angle, we have our answer as to Kendrick's fate. He did, in fact, redeem himself in God's eyes and reach heaven. Then again, maybe it's a bit of a cop-out for me to assume The Heart Part 5 continues the story at all, since it wasn't even released as part of the album. I mean, this is the Mr. Morale section of the video. Maybe I should just stick to the album instead of focusing so much on an unrelated single. It just sucks to think that this is all one big dead end. Wait a minute. Shortly after the album debuted, Kendrick made the decision to retroactively add a track to Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers. This was not released as a bonus track, but as an official addition to the album. And that addition is, of course, The Heart Part 5. Doesn't it feel like this was maybe added in for a reason? I haven't seen much discussion on this topic, but a Google search led me to the idea that this was done to inflate the streaming numbers of the album. But I refuse to believe this is the only reason. Kendrick doesn't strike me as the type of person to compromise the integrity of his album for the sake of boosting his numbers. If he's going to make a change like this, it seems pretty likely that he's doing it because it's an important inclusion to the message he's trying to share. I mean, is it really a coincidence that the only part of the heart that might hold storyline significance just so happens to be the only one that makes it onto an album? I don't think so. And to solidify that point, right before Kendrick says what I recited earlier, he says, "Everything is everything. This ain't coincidental?" I rest my case. But what about the rest of the album? If we already got an answer here as to Kendrick's fate, how does the rest of Mr. M.A.A.d and the Big Steppers play into things? Well, I think I finally have my answer. A major theme of this album is Kendrick acknowledging that his time as the figurehead of the black community has now ended. He acknowledges that he's done just about everything that he can do for his people, and as he mentions on The Heart Part 5, he feels that his creator is pleased with all he's done. On Mr. M.A.A.d and the Big Steppers, Kendrick essentially tells his listeners that he can no longer prioritize making music as he sees taking care of his family as a bigger responsibility for him now. The track Mirror is based around this very idea. The chorus repeats the phrase, "I choose me, I'm sorry," which is Kendrick apologizing to his fans for making the decision to place other priorities above his music. This album serves as Kendrick taking a step back from the story he's been telling and talking to us directly. Not as the Kendrick in the story he's been telling, not as the Kendrick who was damned and redeemed himself, but as the real life Kendrick. And what he tells us is that he's done his part, but now it's up to us to take these lessons he's given us and create a meaningful change with them. He included The Heart Part 5 on the album as a means of giving us closure to the story he's been telling, but the main point of the album is to let us know that it's now time for us to apply these lessons to our own lives. Kendrick is placing his trust in us, as well as the generations to follow, to use his teachings to find for ourselves the same salvation he found. And I can't think of a more poetic ending. So piece it all together and what do we have? The story of Kendrick Lamar. A young kid who realized that his hometown of Compton is suffering, develops a deep resolve to grow famous as a rapper and uses influence to give back to a struggling community, becomes corrupted by his power and influence, succumbs to greed and is damned by God, resolves to do right by his community to redeem himself in the eyes of God, succeeds in his efforts and passes the torch to the next generation to use his teachings to strengthen the community and find salvation. It's bittersweet, but I don't think we'll be getting another Kendrick Lamar album for a long time. So I wanted to take some time to say thank you, Kendrick, for spending years imparting your wisdom on the world in the form of music. And to the viewers who have made it this far, thanks for watching. I know this was a change of pace for my channel since my content so far has been all based around video game content, but I've been wanting to branch out and entertain the idea of incorporating other forms of media into the channel for a while now. If you're only here for the gaming content, don't worry, that's not going anywhere anytime soon, but you can maybe expect to see some more sprinkles of variety in the near future. Anyway, if you enjoyed the video, consider leaving a like and subscribing for more. And if you have any thoughts, be sure to let me know in the comments. With that, it has been me, SketchAV, gonna get up out. Peace!